Hey, welcome to the Likeville podcast. We're talking today with writer Stephen Marche about the recent tragedy in Toronto. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. I really loved your article about this. It was it was just fascinating. But can you perhaps sort of just contextualize, because we have people listening in Australia, New Zealand, all over the place, Israel, so Europe. What happened in Toronto recently?
Well, I guess it was Monday. Was it Monday that it happened, or was it Tuesday? I can't
Mm-hmm.
really remember. Monday, right?
I'm pretty sure it was Monday. Yeah.
Monday. About 1:40 in the afternoon, a lunatic drove a white van up onto Yonge Street, which is the longest street in the world, and he killed 10 people. And Toronto is very much not used to these kinds of events, and is also not a city rife with particular tensions of these kinds that tend to lead to terrorist actions, and is also not a city with a lot of guns, so mass slaughter is really new to us, I guess you would say. And so it was shocking, and the piece was written really kind of in the immediate aftermath of that shock.
Yeah, I mean, it was so soon afterwards that I didn't know the name of the police officer until I read your article. I kept looking to see somebody naming the police officer, and in none of the articles did they mention. I mean, everybody spoke about the heroism of this police officer that didn't shoot him when he was. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because that's
Well,
kind
yeah,
of.
I mean, he was like, no, I didn't know his name until I think 5 minutes before it went up. So, like,
Oh
I didn't
wow.
know his name when I was writing the piece.
Okay.
But like so he was very much, not that it particularly matters really what the name of the guy's was. It's just, he was confronted by this guy. The video footage was probably the most dramatic part of the whole story, and it just was the guy was begging to be shot. The guy kept taking his phone out of his pocket and pointing it at the guy like it was a gun, even though it wasn't a gun. And the guy didn't shoot him, and it was a huge moment, I think, in the
Oh,
history
it
of
was
the city.
amazing. I mean, just a few blocks from my house here in Montreal. This was a few years ago. There was a homeless guy who pulled out a knife, and he clearly, he had some serious mental health problems. And the homeless guy pulled out a knife, and the cops were there, and they shot at him,
Hmm.
missed him, and hit a guy who was driving his bicycle on the way to work his shift at the hospital,
Right.
and killed him. Right. So very often, in situations like that, when it's not nearly as adrenaline pumped and as insane as that probably was,
No. Well, and I think we're obviously.
they shoot the guy.
Well,
Yeah.
we're recovering from the Yatim shooting, which was in 2013, I think, where it was similarly a man with a crazy guy with a knife who was clearly having a mental health episode, and they shot him. Like, they didn't wait, they didn't, they just sort of shot him. And
Yeah.
I think this is kind of the thing where this becomes a message for the police, as much as it,
Hmm.
like, if you don't shoot the guy, you're going to be a hero, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think human beings are, police are human beings, and they make
Sure.
mistakes, and they want glory as much as anyone. And, I think, the key thing for me is that it's like, well, if you don't shoot it, that's what the city wants. That's what we all want. We don't want you to go out and shoot people. We want you to not shoot people. And when you don't shoot people, you will be rewarded.
You'll be, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing that was interesting about your articles. Everybody else was speculating, okay, is this guy a white nationalist that is trying to kill, is he an Islamist? Is he, whatever. Immediately people wanted to, and it was kind of gross,
Mm,
actually. I guess it probably happens all the
yeah.
time, but I've never been so aware of it as I was this time, that there were certain constituencies that just immediately, like turkeys or
Yeah.
hyenas going to carrion, they immediately were thinking, how can I use this to further my political cause?
Exactly.
Like, how does this, like a grumpy married person, like, how can I turn this recent event into proof that this is what I've been telling you all
I
along?
know.
Kind
And
of
I
thing.
mean, I think the thing
Um,
is the worst part of our intellectual life right now is that we all allow ourselves to be defined by our enemies. And, this guy is obviously an enemy, so everyone's waiting around to see who gets the rhetorical win of him being on the opponent's side, of whatever totally fictional intellectual debate we're all having, right? And so, like the thing is that I wrote the piece, I started that night, really before we knew anything about him. His name had just come, it had just be I started writing it right after I knew that his name. We didn't really know anything about him, but I think the point is I think one of the most important things you can do intellectually is try to understand before things happen, that there are different ways that any action can go, right? And so, this guy easily could have been a white nationalist, right? He easily could have been a Bissonnette kind of guy. He could have easily been a one of the various monsters of our
over
time.
The internet guys.
And the question is why? We know that once we find out what he is, there's gonna be all this meaning thrown at it, right? It'll all if he'd been Muslim, if he'd been a new Somali immigrant or something like that, like the guy in Edmonton was, all of this meaning would have gotten thrown onto this act. And the truth is, that's silly. That's not it's kind of before you figure out who this guy is, trying to figure out, it could have been any of these things. Would it really matter? No, because guess what? Every people and every ideology have their people who just want to kill, just want to kill other people. And so actually this event in itself is the horrible deaths. And as it's come out, clear, as the people who the names are being released of the dead, it's even more horrifying. But why grant this event meaning when it actually is meaningless?
Yeah. Well, and also I liked what you said about how, we really need to think about whether these things can be plausibly called terrorism.
Yeah.
They're definitely terrible, but for instance, when I was a kid in southwestern, growing up in working class Montreal, it was a neighborhood with very big Irish population, right? And they would have fundraisers for the IRA. Right. This was the time when you probably remember this. Mickey Rourke gave $1 million to the IRA publicly.
Right.
He was after that he got from 9.5 weeks. He donated. Now the IRA, there was a terrorist organization. It was actually an organization, and they planned things, and they had they planned out. There was an effort. It was all towards a particular goal, right? The PLO, that was an actual terrorist organization. Right. So, and even Al Qaeda, that's a clear terrorist organization. So was the Irgun. ISIS.
So was the Irgun, right?
And so, but where you have somebody who just randomly decides to do this and labels it, that, okay, I'm doing this in the name of, whatever, but the people that are hearing about it for the first time.
Well, it's just as you say, the terrorism of our childhoods, I guess, was a military tool used to achieve a political goal, right? As in Algeria, as in the nationalist struggles, as in the ANC used. So to compare these guys, the guy who did the Pulse shooting in Orlando, was it Orlando or was it Miami? I can't remember.
It was Orlando. Yeah.
They're not worth putting. They're it's literally too complimentary to call them terrorists. It gives them too much significance. It gives them too much a sense that they're part of a larger struggle. And especially in America, where the guy the day before who shot up who killed 4 African Americans in a Waffle House, right? He called himself a sovereign citizen, which I guess you could call a political ideology, but it doesn't make any sense to me to connect his violent act with any kind of political ideology, because we all know that the point is not to change politics. The point is the violence itself, right?
Yeah, and also celebrity.
And celebrity.
Right? Which is one, there were many reasons why I liked your article, but one of them is that, you were focusing on, as they say, right, it's, the dog that didn't bark kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so your article was about the dog that didn't bark. So can you just say, what is the dog that didn't bark in Toronto?
Right. I mean, the dog that didn't. The dog. Is it the dog who did nothing in the night? The Sherlock Holmes story. The dog who didn't.
Oh, the line.
Who didn't move. Right.
The line I always heard was the dog that didn't
Right.
bark, and so it's fairly straightforward that if you see something happening, you try to.
Well, I mean,
explain
literally only
what caused it, but to didn't happen is
Yeah.
takes more thinking.
Well, there was no lockdown. There was not a
Mhm.
single politician of any stripe making any kind of noise about it at all. Other than a few journalists, really pretty, like, we're talking guys with the Rebel here, like, like, who are, I mean, are they, what are they? Like, are they journalists? I'm not sure.
They're
Like, they don't deserve the term journalist just as these people don't deserve the term terrorist, right? Like, they're not, they're not really in the business of, establishing facts or even making real arguments. But so, like, they're they of course are like, oh, it's going to be, and then their disappointment when they find out it's just a lunatic. I mean, it's so appalling. It's just like, it's really time to look in the mirror if you're disappointed that you can't blame a tragedy on a random ethnic group. Like, it's just so absurd. Like, I mean, never mind the racism of it or whatever you want to call it. The sheer stupidity that you're acknowledging in your own ways of analysis, right? Like, so it's like, I think it's, but Toronto had, like, not a shot was fired. I'm going to tell you, if a truck ran over 10 people in New York, shots would be fired.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm sad
down.
to say, but I'm fairly certain that if that happened in Montreal, it would be the same response, because they tend to be pretty trigger happy here as well, right? In situations like that, there's been
you have to remember,
cases
we've come
recently,
through a long period here of long thinking about police brutality, and with a lot of pressure from a lot of groups. And I think it's borne some fruit, right? I mean, like, I think it's like, it has actually borne some kind of, like, the soul searching and like, that guy was obviously trained to within an inch of his life about how not to shoot somebody. I mean, he was so in control. He was so,
you can see it. Yeah.
Not, there was no, the way he was moving, the way he took out
like
his stick and had an
It was
angle.
unbelievable. Yeah.
He knew exactly what he was doing, right? I mean, it wasn't like he wasn't operating by instinct at all. So it's, the pressure that was brought to bear on the police really, I think, paid dividends. I mean, and of course you have to give the police credit for not resisting and for trying to get better, because they sure did get better.
Well, a lot of I think I might have told you this before, but a lot of my students are where I teach. It's the biggest police tech program in Quebec, and so I teach a lot of people who go on to be cops. And so I know a lot of cops in Montreal. I have cop cars stop and say, "Hey, professor," like other stuff. So I know, but
that'll be very handy if you ever commit a crime.
I know. They've explained to me what the training is, and it's very interesting. It's a lot of it is very similar to the training you get in boxing, right? Because I thought of this immediately when I read your article, right? In boxing, one of the first things you have to learn is how to resist the jab, right? Because the jab is, if you're right-handed, you jab up towards somebody's face with the left, and they reflexively put their hands up to block it, and then you hammer them with the one that matters, right? And the beauty of the jab is that it bypasses your rational brain and goes right to your reflexes, right? And so in boxing, one of the things they teach you is how to resist the jab, to not fall for it, right? Yeah. And with police training and with all kinds of military training, they're basically getting you, as you said, to not be sort of going into reflex mode, into reactionary mode, where you're just like a reptile brain, adrenaline kind of thing, and you actually sort of rely on your training, which the police officer did that too. But it was interesting because you saw him as sort of like a kind of a metaphor for the whole city's response, which was not to give in to the jab, not to sort of get all crazy in response to this, which is really is amazing. I think it was Napoleon who said, "Never do what the enemy wishes you to do."
Right.
Right. So,
Well, I mean, before it was sort of had this moment like before we knew who it was. I
yeah,
mean, and to me, that was like the key insight of that piece is like, it's like, well, okay, we don't know who it is now. So what would happen if it were like, what would happen if it were not just to me, the incel arguments about this are pretty, I mean, to call that a political philosophy, I mean, yes, somebody who drives over people on the street is involved in various forms of spiritual toxicity, but to connect that to some kind of,
yeah,
larger political play. It's just ridiculous.
yeah.
But
And
but the
also,
but the
as Barbara Kay pointed out, to compare it to what Marc Le Pen did, right here in my
yeah,
city, it just doesn't make sense.
exactly.
He was very
It
careful
doesn't.
to divide them, to let the men go and then kill the women. Right? This guy was
Well,
just
he is
mowing
like an
down
old
everybody.
terrorist. He had names in pockets, right?
Yeah.
Like he thought through it, right? I mean, he had
Mm-hmm.
some of my friends' names in his pocket. I mean,
Wow.
yeah, it's a. I mean, the I guess the question is whether misogyny really is the same as a political philosophy, which we don't really even know about this guy yet. We don't really even know what his spiritual condition was, but I mean, to me, it was more like, what does it matter? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Like, because like we all know that what we're dealing with here is spectacular violence. And to debate politics around it, to allow these people to shape our debate in any way is insane.
Yeah.
But the other thing was that I was like, I don't think Toronto will care. Like,
And you
I
were
honestly
right.
don't.
You're right. They've
Like, I mean, well,
responded so
even
well.
say it had been, a Muslim jihadist terrorist, I don't think the reaction here would have been, "My God, we've got to get rid of all the Muslims." Like,
Mm-hmm.
or if it had been a white nationalist, it certainly wouldn't have been like, we need to. Our multicultural plan is not working out. White people aren't assimilating, aren't dealing with it well enough. Like, multiculturalism here is a true belief system. Like, it is,
Mm-hmm.
everyone believes it. It's not it's so ingrained into the values of this city that nothing could shake it. Right? Like, no terrorist act of either side of this silly war could really shake it, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember right after I was living in Baltimore when September 11th happened, and actually two of our friends died on September 11th. One in the Pentagon and one in the World Trade Center. But I remember on September 12th, I woke up and I looked out in the window and somebody had scrawled on the sidewalk, just like down below. I was on the third floor in big kind of chalk, "Kill all Arabs." All right.
Right.
And there was all sorts of violence happening. There was all sorts of crazy. Johns Hopkins actually recommended to a lot of students to just stay home until things calm down because people were getting punched just randomly when they were walking around campus. And it was very ugly. Things got very, very, very crazy. And
Mhm.
um yeah, I mean, I'm just so fascinated that didn't happen in Toronto. There's been
Well,
no.
I
Yeah.
think the thing is, like, Toronto, what's kind of infuriating about living here is that
It's the first time
it's
I
such
heard you
a
say nice things about Toronto was in that article.
well, it's very it doesn't make myths very well, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't create heroes. It sort of thinks things don't really matter, and anyone who really makes it here, it's because they've made it somewhere else. Ultimately, right? Like, no one, if you like, no one here takes seriously if you're just successful in Toronto. Then you're just like whatever. And that diminishment of meaning, like the automatic diminishment of meaning, which is such a trait of, I would even say, English Canada more generally, but Toronto as well. That mythlessness. It's like, well, this event isn't going to mean as much as, like, when someone attacks New York, they immediately go, everything has changed forever. I remember going to the 9/11 museum in New York. And I remember thinking that it was the greatest folly they could have done. To memorialize, to give that action so much power
Mm-hmm.
over them,
Yeah.
to insist on remembering it, because that's exactly what the terrorists want.
Yep.
In a way, that building is a shrine to the killers,
Yeah.
and to the power of their action and to the immensity of their action, right? Whereas, like, if they just rebuilt and said, here's another building, that would have been a much more profound fuck you to the
Oh, I
terrorists.
totally agree. I mean, you look at like what the Assyrians would do when they conquered an area that had like been really fucking with them. Or if you look at, what God tells the ancient Hebrews to do in the Bible, again and again, you hear the same lines. Do not leave one stone on top of another. They would just
Right.
obliterate the memory of you completely. And that was the sort of the most supreme. They wouldn't erect a monument to you or make a
Well,
museum,
they think it's a monument. It's this immense, and it has this quote from Virgil in it. I can't remember it exactly. It's something like some comment about time in huge letters, and it's this immense building with all these oversized things. And of course, the terrorist faces are not present in there. Only the faces of the dead. But what the terrorists want is to change history.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're essentially saying is you won. You did change history.
Yeah.
But it's only by the grace of the meaning that we give to these things that they change anything at all.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you've written a great deal, and I know you're sort of in the process of writing a book on celebrity. I mean, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
terrorism and celebrity, there's a huge overlap between those two phenomenons at this point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you think about these people who say we should just not publish the names of the terrorists? We shouldn't put their faces everywhere. We should. I mean, do you think that's actually a realistic strategy? I mean, or do you think that's just silly and it's just not going to work?
Well, I don't know how. I mean, increasingly in the world that we live in, I'm not sure how far any correct policy is actually realistic, right? But like, I mean,
Oh, I see what you mean. Because
because
like
like,
the rebel will put it out, or somebody else will put it out anyway. It'll come out anyway.
well, look, I mean, no. We want to know, right? We all sit around wanting to know. And I mean, when you look at, like, when the history of September 11th is eventually written, it'll obviously be the most successful military act of of our lifetimes. I mean, with one act, they changed the entire frame of reference of the United States.
Yeah.
Right. They changed its borders. They changed the way its relationship to the entire world. They caused, at least two wars of, that, I don't know whether you want to count Syria as the third, but they cause at least two wars of enormous cost and significance through a single act. And none of that was required.
Yeah.
None of that was necessary. But the meaning, like the turning September 11th into this sacred day, essentially made all of that possible.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we're getting to a point now. Well, I mean, the new murders, like the ones in France and the ones in England and the ones at the Pulse nightclub, like we are getting inured to this stuff. It doesn't have the same effect as it once did.
Well, I think in
but
Europe,
I don't know if that's a good or bad
I don't know
thing.
if that's going to happen in Europe. I mean, the sense I got, last time I was in France was that if these terrorist attacks become more common,
Yeah.
you could see something very, very ugly happen.
Well, it's already there.
No,
I mean,
I'm
France
talking
is
like way more than what they have now. Like I can imagine a scenario where, and this makes me sick, but I can imagine a scenario where they basically just have mass deportations, like what you saw after World War II, where the like places like
right.
Czechoslovakia just deported millions of the German population, people who had been there sometimes 6-7 generations. They just deported all Germans because they're like, you know what, we can't trust you at all anymore. At least half of your community collaborated with the Nazis when they invaded. And you know what? We just don't trust you anymore to be our neighbors. And they deported them all. That happened all over Eastern Europe, right? And the
Right.
same thing has happened with the dissolution of the USSR. In some places, they've deported sort of people that are ethnically Russian out of other smaller stands and things like that. So I that's what I fear as kind of one of the really ugly possibilities, which would never, like you say, that would never happen in Canada and the United States because it's just not part of the way the game is played.
Well, I don't know. I mean, when you look at what they're doing to Mexicans, right? When you look what they're doing to Mexican Americans, like they're like it is mass deportation. It is a form of ethnic cleansing, right? Like it is a form of real of an attempt to shape the ethnic nature of a country, right?
Well, I think
that country being that country being America. I mean, I more think like when you go to Paris, like Paris is militarized in a way that maybe, I mean, it certainly wasn't when I was younger. Right? I mean, there's just guys with machine guns on the street everywhere.
All over the place. They're but you know, they do actually here in Montreal after those van attacks started.
Right.
We have all these like street sales and festivals and the jazz festival and stuff like that here in Montreal, and so they were really worried that there was going to be something like that here in Montreal last summer. And so what they did is they put in all these kind of concrete blocks at every block, every big intersection, so that if there was something, a van like that, they could only go one block, basically. Like they wouldn't be able to go very far. And they also had, on the really, really big festival days, on top of that, they also had sharpshooters on the top of a couple of the roofs, just so that if there was somebody who tried to do something like that, they would take them out. I mean, so, which I'd never heard of anything like that in Montreal in my whole life. I mean, that was, you know, they clearly were quite worried about something like that happening. But yeah, I mean, it's nothing like Paris.
Well, yeah, it is interesting to think of like, I mean, Canada's a really interesting case. Like, you know, I wonder if the FLQ crisis kind of inured us to the, like, we sort of looked down the barrel of the gun immediately. You know what I mean? Like in the 70s, like where it was like, well, how extreme are we going to be about this? You know?
Well, it was pretty extreme. The War Measures Act. I mean, that's like,
well,
wow.
The War Measures Act couldn't really be. You couldn't be more extreme. My point is that's the most extreme possible response, right? I mean, a minor act of terrorism, and I mean, not that. I mean, I know people died, but like, you declare martial law. I mean, you know,
yeah,
like that's not seem. But I wonder if the very over, like the absurdity, like the absurd over extremeness of that kind of. You know, I remember, it's just that I remember in high school, like debates about the War Measures Act were, like it was a very much a thing that we talked about, where it was like, well, what are the limits of the state when they're threatened by engines that want to destroy it, right? And so we've all kind of had that in the back of our minds for a long time, you know?
Well, and there's also the anti-globalization movement. I mean, they've had, and the Maple Spring here in Montreal, they had... there were a lot of situations where the cops actually were being quite violent and doing things which were not sort of,
totally
I mean, like kettling, you know, like sort of just like getting people together and doing mass arrests and giving, you know, a lot of people that I know were arrested in those sweeps and things like that. Almost nobody paid their tickets. I mean, it was just a form of harassment. They weren't actually intending on collecting those tickets, but there has been a pretty strong response to that. I think there was if I remember correctly, there was a judge in Toronto that actually said some really, really harsh stuff about the way the police had responded to the anti-globalization movement. Do you recall what was it?
I don't remember it, but I mean, I know there were. Well, I certainly know that like. Or I would say, like, it was not just anarchists who were deeply unhappy with that response.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, they were also, the cops were also doing they got busted, if I remember correctly. I mean, they have here as well, but where they would dress up like protesters and then would do, like they were basically like agent provocateur, like they were like dressing up like protesters and then doing something violent in order to justify the cops, coming in and like cracking down. And it was, or trying to incite the crowd to, but they got busted, if I remember correctly, in Toronto because like, everybody has a cell phone now, and somebody was like filming it and they saw that this person dressed up as a protester, first of all, looked way too muscular to be like a vegan anarchist, and then also had like police issue boots on. Like,
Yeah.
and that's how they got busted. And it was one of the things that they said, well, this is highly unethical and illegal. Like, why are you dressing up like protesters and doing all this stuff, right? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have this. Canada has an odd relationship to order, right?
how so?
I mean, well, like we think of ourselves as very liberal, but we declared martial law. After like, and that was like Pierre Trudeau. That was like the
Yeah.
liberal guy, right? I mean, like, oh, aren't we sweet? Oh, there's some disturbance in the streets of Quebec City. We're shutting down the legal
Yeah.
system, right? You can habeas corpus no longer
Yeah.
applies. Like, and similarly, like I think it's not hard. Like, and the G7 stuff, which was incredibly
Yeah.
appalling.
Yeah.
Like,
No, my wife and I were
like-
at the anti-globalization protest in Quebec City back then. That was before we had kids, and we got tear gassed, and we got like it was just absolutely, it was terrible.
I mean, and those were never even like, when I was in Washington for the inauguration, like, things were just, people were burning, like I have the gas cap from the limousine that they burned, which I took home as a souvenir.
Jesus.
But like, yeah, it's great. It's a great souvenir. But like the gas cap of a limousine that was burned on the inauguration. But like it was so, and they were really smashing things. Now, they did immediately go in and arrest those people, and they all charged them with felonies. So they'll go to federal prison and they'll have records forever, which is like a complete overreaction. But I don't know. I think we like to think of ourselves in Canada as above that sort of thing, but in practice, we're really not.
Yeah.
Like if the powers that be ever get really scared, even moderately, they tend to react pretty brutally.
Yeah. In fact, well, I just look at I'm amazed, right, that the federal government comes out with these new laws making it completely fine to spy on us in all different ways. And again, when they look at opinion polls, most Canadians are like, whatever. I'm sure they're doing it for the right reasons. And, if you're not doing anything wrong, you've got nothing to worry about. Back to Tim Hortons, like whatever. Like, it's just,
That's right.
It's been very hard to kind of try and mobilize people. I mean, this is one thing actually when Jordan Peterson was first getting on, his being really sort of freaked out about, this new law, which is going to take us to the gulags. I mean, one of the things I said in a sort of an online kind of discussion with him in the comments section of one of his things is I said, okay, well, I understand like why you're worried about this. It doesn't seem to me like it's going to go in that direction at all. But we do have this like really big law that's actually enacted. It has been for a little while, which is much more likely to sort of lead us in really ugly totalitarian directions potentially than this is. And I haven't heard you say anything about that. Why are you not talking about that? And his response was actually quite humble. He said, yeah, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't paying attention when that came out.
Right.
And, it's sad to say, but you tend to notice the stuff that is happening in your own backyard, and you notice that, and you don't notice other things. So I agree. He said, I agree completely that that's a really big issue to pay attention to, and probably a bigger attention than this. But, that ship has sailed. This one has not.
Yeah.
which is, I thought he very often will ask him like a straight question like that, and rather than getting, he is Canadian after all, right? Like, he'll,
Yeah.
rather than getting really defensive and doubling down, he'll very often sort of in this kind of squeaky prairie voice like, well, yeah, oh, and you're just like, oh, you are Canadian. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a different, it's
He's
yeah.
very Canadian. Well, he has both. He has this tension that we've been
Yeah,
talking about, right?
kind of authoritarian and
Order and
sweetness, sort of. Yeah,
exactly. Like and insistent on liberty, but also not at all. Right? You
yes,
know what I
I
mean?
know.
Like
Yeah, it's liberty of,
but also like whatever. Like theoretically interested in liberty, but
well,
not really.
interested in
I mean,
liberty.
it's
I think, in his defense, I think what he would say is he really wants liberty in the private sphere, and he wants people to be able to sort of do what they want in their own homes and do it there within certain spheres. But when it comes to anything about keeping the peace and, guarding the city walls, then at that point, almost anything goes, and he's no libertarian. Like,
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is amazing to me how like the framework of your I mean, to me, like the notion of being a subject as opposed to being a citizen really has these profound effects
how
on
so?
people. We don't we don't think of ourselves as that distinct from America in a lot of ways, but then like when you're a citizen, like ultimately the government exists to protect you from
Yeah.
power, right? Like the power is the queen, but she is completely divested of power. She's not even allowed to have an
Mm-hmm.
opinion, and and the government protects us from that. Whereas in America, they're citizens, so they are responsible for defending themselves from power, and the power is the
Yeah.
government. And so it creates this very distinct notion, like a relationship to order as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I would never think of. I mean, at the worst, that's why in Canada they think every single problem has a
Yeah.
government solution, right? I mean, especially in the culture industries, you come up with
Oh my God, that
again
is
and
so
again. It's
true.
like
That is so true. Oh, that's
it's like,
so
well, the
true.
government will fix it. The government. What we need is
Yeah.
another grant
Yeah.
for X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, not every problem can actually be
Yeah.
solved by a granting agency. Like, there are some problems that are actually the
Yeah.
responsibility of people, or that cultures are products of people, like rather than government programs. But and that's why going to America, it can be so
Mm-hmm.
liberating, because it's like they just want to build things. They don't think we'll get the government to
Yeah. And
build things.
people give a lot
Um,
of money and time to charity in the States in a way that, I've never, growing up here, especially in Montreal, I've never seen. When I've lived in the States, I've lived in some different places, and they people volunteer a lot of time to various kinds of, nonprofit organizations, and they give a lot of money to it. So yeah, I mean, that's part of what you're saying. That citizen mentality, that we have to build something and make it happen, and that can be very, that can have its good sides for sure. I mean, but here I think
yeah,
it's, yeah, like you say, it's a sort of a paternalistic attitude that, like, we expect mommy and daddy to keep us safe and, make the trains run on time and
yeah,
pay the bills on time, and if the power goes out, we don't think, oh, maybe we should, like, vote mommy and daddy out of office and put in, like, new parents that can actually, like, make the trains run on time. Instead, Canada, it's this indignant response, like, I can't believe, like, this is your responsibility. Like, you're supposed to take care of us. I can't believe you let this happen, and like, and the strange thing is that it actually seems to, for the most part, work.
yeah. Well,
Well, it works in the
work in what
sense that it
sense?
seems to, regardless of what, party is in power, it seems to very often lead them to take care of us and do the right thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's probably terribly terrible for us in some way, but
Well, it definitely leads to a better government. I mean, you know, well, I don't know. I mean, after a lifetime of being sort of absent, casually Republican, I think my appreciation for uh, monarchical democracy is parliamentary democracy with constitutional monarchy has greatly increased over the past 5 years. I'll tell you that. I
Yeah.
mean, like, I don't know how good Prince Charles is going to be, but I'd rather have him than Donald Trump. I mean, as head of state,
Yeah. Well,
any day.
I guess if
You
your
know, I
presumption,
mean,
a lot of it is political culture, right? If your presumption is that your
yes,
government is this kind of like a lion, that's like useful, or some ferocious guard dog which could turn on you at any moment, and so you're wary of it, and you're always like trying to check its power, and you're worried. There's some good things about that. Definitely, maybe it prepares you for tyrants better than other governments, but it also is really tiresome. And I think, like, the Canadian government, the state
yeah,
here, and the state in many sort of northern European countries can get a lot of stuff done because people just, their presumption is that they're trying to do the right thing and they're trying to fix something, right? The presumption is not that
yeah,
you're trying to steal from me, right? There, which I don't know
right,
how, if you have so little trust, right? And I mean, to some extent, as you mentioned last time on the podcast, this is sort of an artifact of Reagan, right? The Reagan era that we're still dealing with. That he basically said the problem is not the problems; the problem is government, right? Government is not the solution; government is the problem,
right,
and so just kind of changed the political culture a great deal, so that you look at kind of Pew Research into opinion polls, like how much confidence do you have in your mayor, in your governor, in the Congress, in president, in the federal government. If you look at that stuff from the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, 60s, Americans had, even in rough times, they had a high degree of confidence in their government. They don't have that now.
yeah.
And left,
No,
right,
they
even
don't.
the
It's
center to
true.
some extent, they just, there's this deep, yeah.
What center?
You don't
There's
think
no
so
center.
anymore?
No,
Because
in
I
the United
really
States,
feel that
no.
there's a center in Canada, like big time.
In Canada, there's. I mean, no, no, no. I mean, when you go to America and talk to people, um, like I'm from Alberta, so all of my cousins, all of my
Mm-hmm.
uncles, they're all conservative, right? And I like them all, right? Like that is not possible in the
You
United
would need
States.
to excommunicate them,
That
or be
simply does not
excommunicated
happen.
yourself.
They're or they would excommunicate me. They would regard me like it's the degree of loathing. I mean, the most startling fact is like no one in either party wants their children
Yeah.
to marry people from the other party. I mean, who would care about that here? You know, like your daughter is dating a boy and he is interested in conservative. I mean, it'd be weird because he'd be
Yeah.
interested in a political party at all. But
Yeah.
like, would you care?
There's
No,
a,
like
that
whatever.
I
I
can't
mean,
remember her name. She's a black conservative, young, very good looking. Kanye West had that tweet like a week or two ago where he said, like, I like the way she thinks, or whatever it is.
yes.
I can't remember what her name is.
Who
But
was that?
somebody sent me like
Oh,
a YouTube video of her, and she has a video that sort of is making fun of this, and it's quite funny, actually. And so she basically acts out
right.
like a couple of different scenarios. Like, one of them is, I'm in an interracial relationship, and she acts out telling her parents that. And her parents are really, really supportive, and they're like, "Oh, that's wonderful, that's great." Then she acts out, sort of coming out to her parents and saying, like, "I'm gay, and like, I'd like you to meet my girlfriend." And like, she acts out, like, sort of telling her parents about that, and her parents are completely fine. And then she says, "I'm a conservative." And her parents are crying, and they're like,
Yeah.
what did we do wrong?
Right.
And like, like, this is, what are we gonna
What we do
do?
wrong?
Like, this is gonna be so embarrassing. You don't know what this is gonna do to me and with my friends, and like, you're hurting the family. And like, it's hilarious. It's like, she really nails what you're talking about right there, that it is kind of, it has become so polarized. It's polarizing in a way that Look Who's Coming Home for Dinner was back in the day, right? Like,
Well, I think it's more. I mean, like those are certainly related things, right? I mean, because like I was doing this research into this piece and like looking at the levels of well, it's called effective partisanship. It essentially means like instead of political disagree, it's actually instead of ideational disagreements, it's just physical
Yeah.
loathing for the other side. And like there's a really interesting group that did this study that in the 1980s, racial resentment as a category was as a psychological category was
Oh
equal for
wow.
Democrats and Republicans. They were the same in 1980, and now it's about 80% of Republicans have, and it's declined on Democrats and it's grown enormously in Republicans. So you have this party of racial resentment. I mean, that's why if you were an African American father and your daughter came to you and said, "I'm a
Hmm.
Republican," you'd be freaked out, right? Like, I mean, it really gets down to these very essential questions of, I mean, really, ultimately, there's two visions of America at play. One is as a white federation, and the other is as a multicultural society. And they can't. They're not. They're not. No side is winning, and they're also not going away. And I really
Well, what do
don't
you
know
think? I
how
mean,
it's
this is
going to end.
actually perfect thing. I was going to ask you this at another point, but since you're so interested in celebrity, I mean, what about this whole Kanye West thing? I mean, it's just bizarre. Like, yeah,
It's
yeah,
not bizarre. I wrote about it a long
yeah,
time
yeah,
ago.
yeah,
I mean, you remember that LA Review of Books
yeah.
piece book about celebrity politics? I mean, anyone who's surprised by this at all has not been paying attention to Kanye West. I mean, like, or to the changing nature of celebrity politics. I mean, this is why, like, it's so naive when people are like people actually believe like I didn't write this piece because I just thought it would be too controversial, but like, which is a rare thing for me. But like when Beyonce was at Coachella, everyone was like, "This is a huge political act. This performance of strength and beauty." And in an African American woman, right, and how this is going to change the world, and I'm like, it is going to change the world, but
Yeah.
you don't understand how, because Kanye is a perfect example. Because like first of all, no one is really able. Everyone right now is trying to adjust their politics to this pop culture that they love because there is this unbelievably naive assumption that like that pop culture produces the ends of its own claim, right? That like it's like, oh well, this is what Bay is saying, so that's going to have this kind of, it's going to have a result, and there's, it's, and it's actually like, well, no, because celebrity inherently is about
Mm-hmm.
consumable bodies, right? And that's what I think, that's what Kanye West understands perfectly. It's like what he understands about, and the reflection of a narcissism in another, and what he understands about Donald Trump is that he's evidence that you can win all power simply
Yeah.
on the power of celebrity, and that reflects, that
Well,
has
I think
meaning
also
for
what he,
Kanye
I mean, and
West.
Chance the Rapper was
So,
also sort of tweeting.
well, that was really because Chance the Rapper is actually a great artist, and well, both of them are, but like
Then
he
what?
should have known better than that. He really should have. Well, he's trying to appease the celebrity gods, right? Because everyone makes this deal between celebrity and being an artist. Like there's no escaping that, because the reality that we live in is this image saturated world, and this world where the negotiation of image is the whole meaning of the world. And so Kanye West has just basically decided to run with it as
Mm-hmm.
far and as fast as he can. But everyone else really is in this game of both wanting it and not wanting it. So I think what Chance the Rapper did was like try and play this game where he's on the side of Kanye West as an artist, but also trying to hide his own politics, right? But you can't, because
But I
ultimately
mean,
celebrity just wins
what he
everything.
said is, I
mean,
thought was interesting. He said, we need to stop right now. The Democrats take us for granted the way that Republicans have taken evangelicals for granted for a long time, and we need to do exactly what evangelicals did at a certain point to the Republican Party, saying like, what have you done for me lately, right? Like, have you actually are you actually uh,
and look how well that worked out for them. I mean, I'm sorry, but saying let's model ourselves on the political decisions
I think
of the
he's
evangelicals of the
speaking
United
purely
States
in like Machiavellian
is
terms.
not.
Like as a if you are a sort of a group, a minority group with a particular set of sort of needs, and if you feel like a political party is taking you for granted and just not paying attention to and trying really really hard to bend over backwards to get the votes of these sort of mythological poor whites and Rust Belt states, that can be swung this way or that way. Well, maybe we need to remind them that we can be swung too, right? That they can't necessarily count on our votes if they're going to do nothing for us, right? I mean, that's sort of.
No, I've heard this argument a million times. I mean, the thing about this argument is well, one party might take you for granted, but the other party is not really convinced that you're fully a citizen. So that's not much of a choice, right? Yeah, it's not good choice. It's not having good choices, but one of these people, these are not the same. They really aren't. I just think with Kanye, we all have to acknowledge that the thing that I don't think Democrats really are willing to acknowledge, although Cynthia Nixon in New York is a bit of is a star, is you're going to have to play this game or lose. They should absolutely try to get Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on a ticket.
But don't you think the celebrity politics
serious.
can
I'm deadly
backfire
serious
sometimes? Because I mean, you saw with in the last election, right, with Trump and Hillary and stuff like that. Hillary had all sorts of star power, and it actually ended up backfiring in a lot of places because people like Milo were making fun of well, why don't you just go sing and do your thing and stop telling me how to vote.
No. The lesson of Hillary is that Hillary wasn't a celebrity.
So he is, but she had lots of stars supporting her publicly.
But you've got to be the celebrity. That's not enough anymore. You actually have to be able to navigate the constant attention generating, and an actual really good example of this is Justin Trudeau. This should be the model where because he is a celebrity, and then he's a very rare case of a man who has both the overwhelming vanity to be a celebrity, but also enough humility to know that he can't run things himself.
That is a really awesome mix.
And then no, I'm serious.
Yeah,
it is a very potent combination. I mean, Trump has this overwhelming ego that makes him do all this crazy stuff, but he's not smart enough to know that he doesn't know things. And this will all end in tears. It's not. It's ticking along now, but it's things happen that require real decisions. So it's not going to end well. But I think the thing is that the Democrats need to absolutely look if Kanye West ran for whatever party in 2024, he would win.
Yeah.
That's a fact of life that we're living with now. And to pretend that it's not is really nostalgic. And honestly, Oprah should run.
So if Drake ran in Toronto,
she should run, and then she should retreat to the White House and get a perfect right-hand woman who knows exactly how to run
Elizabeth Warren
government, and let her run.
That would be an awesome mix. Yeah. But I mean,
exactly.
Is it different in Canada? I mean, could somebody obviously we have Trudeau, but could somebody Drake run for mayor of Toronto and win?
He'd win in a heartbeat.
Drake for
How
mayor,
could he
folks.
not?
You heard it here,
What do you think?
folks.
It's different here. Do you
Stephen
remember Rob
Marche. Yeah.
Ford?
Yes, I know
Do you
Rob
remember
Ford
Rob
was just
Ford?
absolute
Do you remember Rob
dumpster
Ford?
fire. Yeah.
Who was a pure? He was a. He was just a. No, no one knew he could run it. Everyone knew he couldn't run a thing. But like he was a celebrity, he was a
Yeah.
buffoon, and so it didn't really matter. No. Toronto, Canada is the most connected society on earth.
I
It's the
didn't know
most
that.
social media
Oh,
pick
wow.
up it as the most. Oh yeah. We're
Huh.
as well as the most educated society on earth, and most
Wow.
people with post-secondary education. Anyway, if you want to call that as educated, and so like that means that we're absolutely as vulnerable as any of them. More so. I mean, I actually think we're ahead. Like we had
Mm-hmm.
Justin Trudeau come from the third party to a majority government
Yeah.
using the power of social media, right? That was 2015. That was 2014, 2015 here. So that happened in America 2016. We had Rob Ford, who won on the basis of celebrity as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
any kind of value um, before them. So no, we're actually ahead of the curve because this stuff is not. This stuff is in the essence of the
Yeah.
change that we're all living through, right? Like technology is part of it, but it's also like the advent of
Yeah.
everyone carrying around a camera with them all the time, and the spiritual and artistic and like the consequences of that are so profound that it's hard to see them. But yeah, it is absolutely happening here. I mean, I I do not think for a moment that Andrew Scheer is going to. I mean, I know all the polls are saying all this stuff, but like, no, like there's
Yeah.
the battle is going to be fought on social media. If you're not fighting there, if you're not fighting on Facebook, you're not
Because
fighting.
so many
And
people just
the
aren't
media
watching the six
misses it
o'clock news
because
anymore. They just don't.
well, we don't matter. Like we can't figure out that like the opinions of people on 6 o'clock TV news panels do not register. What registers is like push-up videos,
Yeah.
right? Like that's what actually registers. Like, I mean, it's not when you have a viral. Like I wrote a piece in 2015 in the New York Times, like about the closing of the Canadian Mind, and it went super viral, more viral than anything I've ever done. It
Wow.
was read by about 7 million people, and like it was, and that I think did have some impact. But the truth of the matter is, like, virality can come from any. What matters is the sharing device,
Yeah.
much less than the creation of the content, right? And Trudeau is just he's in a league of his own. I mean, at least the NDP
Yeah.
elected a guy who can fight for that. Like, you can fight for that space, but I don't think it's really going to matter.
Yeah, I just to give you an example, I had a former student I ran into the other day, who this is somebody she read your book in my class, and she has been following you on social media ever since then, and she this so goes to illustrate what you're talking about. She said to me, she goes, I was at my parents' house the other day, and the TV was on, and I saw Stephen Marche was on TV. He was like, a
Right.
talking head. He was like talking about something, and I just started laughing. I said, well, he's been doing that for years. Like he does that all the time, and he had no idea because like
Right.
there are whole generations that don't ever pay attention to talking
Don't
heads
care.
on TV. They don't
Well,
watch the news, and they don't watch like the opinions of blah 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 PhD expert in this, and they're not paying attention. But if you say
That's
it on
right.
Twitter, they'll hear about it.
And I mean, it is very interesting because I've always been shocked by like when you're on TV, people notice you, right?
Yeah.
And like I've been on the cover of a lot of magazines, like written cover stories with my name on them, on like the cover of the Atlantic, the cover. No, nobody knows.
Esquire,
Right?
all these things. Yeah.
Like whatever, but like nobody knows. Like the media that matter here are the image making media, right? and the spread of viral media through image it's so potent. It just erases everything else, right?
Yeah.
And so how things play on the National or in the Globe and Mail, God forbid, don't matter.
Yeah, I know, it's so true.
It just doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, right now, Sebastian and I are actually going we're going to see Jordan Peterson is giving a talk here in Montreal in an hour, and we're going to sort of inspect to see like what's going down, to check it out. And I mean, that's a perfect example of somebody who has really known how to rock the YouTube and work social media and has built this like massive empire. And meanwhile, the people who are his detractors, who are legion, they are for the most part trashing him in places where nobody that he's appealing to goes.
And the thing that's funny though is that it drives him crazy. That's the thing that's so funny. It's because it's like, and he goes on about like how big his numbers are. Right?
Yeah,
like it's like I got like, but it's like, but then one guy takes a shot at him at the New York Review of Books. Not only the New York Review of Books, but the New York Review of Books online.
Yeah.
And he can't take it. He so much wants that traditional approval, right? From those like traditional sources. But
well, I think he's had it for most of his life. I mean, I was listening to Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, and he wrote like The Happiness Hypothesis and all these other books. But Jonathan Haidt mentioned that when he interviewed at Harvard, when he just got out of grad school, actually on the committee was Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was teaching at Harvard at the time, and so I think what you're detecting is right on. But I think it's because he has been part of the club for almost all of his adult life. He's been sort of an establishment figure. Like when he was doing his training here in Montreal, he was friends with all of the people I know at the Douglas Hospital and at McGill and stuff like that. He is a respectable academic,
and yet he feels so marginalized and victimized.
Well, I think within the tribe of academia, of which I am a member of that tribe, he very much is. He's considered to be like just a joke in this tribe. I mean, he's not. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but anyway. So I'm gonna go now, and we're gonna go to his thing. I'm just curious. Do you have, if you if you could smuggle a question in to ask him during the question period, what would it be?
I wouldn't ask him anything.
You wouldn't ask him.
I have no questions for him.
Yeah, like what color are your underwear or something like that.
I mean, I feel I know all about that guy.
You feel?
I feel I know more than I want to know. Like I don't have any questions.
You have no questions, no comments, no comment yet. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about this. And I think I really, really like the way you think about these things, and especially to be able to come up with that so quickly. And that's fantastic. That is exactly what, in a perfect world, that's exactly what the sort of intelligentsia or journalism, whatever, slap any name you want. That's exactly what they should be doing, which is to sort of help us process something that's happened in real time in an intelligent way, rather than just sort of not just giving into the jab. I mean, not just giving into the jab, not going for the knee-jerk responses of all the various kinds, and actually just saying, well, let's look what's actually going on here. But anyway, thank you so much. It was a great article, pleasure, and I look forward to your next thing. I'm always reading you. So.
I will. You'll see it, I'm sure.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye. Talk to you soon.
So, yes, if you would like to support the Likeville podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, and also, share our podcast with your friends, even with your enemies. And also, if you'd like to support us financially, you can do so through Patreon. All right. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye for now.